Also, I mentioned a software this morning that can help you for keeping track of your hours on site. I'm just going to share the reference here. So it was a software to be able to help you keep track of your time on site. So when your foreman is on site and he's able to keep track on his phone, he would pick the people on site and then he picks the materials. It helps you to keep track of the costs on site. All right, everyone, we're going to get started again. If you can have a seat, be great. And this is what it looks like when you're on this software here. You're able to tell the time on each task on the job site. Green means you're doing great. Red means you're over. And yellow means that you're close to being over. So, all right, guys, I need your attention. I need everyone to go back, please. If you want a free demonstration of that business management software, you can just take a picture of that and it'll bring you right to a page where you can get a free demo. All right. All right. So I'm going to keep going. We were talking about base preparation. And I want to go from base preparation to talking about efficiency. But first, we still have to talk about the bedding layer, which you can use with HPB, sand. I've seen stone dust used a lot. So we want to talk about all these in a few minutes. And the importance of it. So if we look at, let's talk about edging first, and then we'll go into the bedding layer for sand. But when we're doing edging, there's many ways to edging seems pretty straightforward. You install edging, you drive a spike, and it stays in place, right? Not really, right? The reason why you have to consider two important things. First, your edging has to be placed directly on the base. So if you're using sand or HPB, technically you have to scrape it down to the base. Especially if it's sand and on a dense graded base, you have to install it on the most solid part. If you're going to use open graded stuff, then you have to use the right edging and the right type of spikes so that it's stable. Okay. If you're using dense graded material, then your spike it shouldn't be easy to drive into your base. If it's easy to drive your spike into a dense graded base, it means that your base is not properly compacted. So if you have a 3-pound mallet and you can drive the spike just by hitting it and it goes right in more than a couple inches at a time, it means that it's not hard enough. Okay? It's not compacted enough. So usually, you can drive it by hand, or you can use something like this where you're using an attachment. The advantage with this is definitely the speed. It goes a lot faster. But also, there's another thing that makes plastic edging or any type of edging fail is that when you're driving your spike into the base material, oftentimes when you get close to the edging, your last hit, the top of the nail will hit the plastic edging or whatever edging you're using, and it'll bounce back up. And that causes basically a void to be created in the ground where water is going to puddle and it's going to push your nail up when there's frost, or especially every season when there's freeze thaw, that's what's going to happen. If there's water that gets in there, it'll push the nail up, and then eventually it pushes the edging as well. So if you've ever seen edging after the winter come up and stay up, and then it just gets worse and worse every year. That's one of the reasons, is because there's a void underneath the nail, and oftentimes it's caused by that last hit. So leaving about a 1/4 inch, the top of the head of the nail, leaving a 1/4 inch from the top, from the head of the nail to the plastic edging, just leave about a 1/4 inch. It'll still be as stable, but it'll prevent that hit from that head to bounce back up and create that void. The main functions. The main functions of plastic edging is to hold the pavers tightly together and to maintain consistent interlock. It's also to prevent pavers from spreading due to forces from tires or minor settlement. It holds the pavers stationary while receiving occasional impact from tires and other traffic. Edge restraints are required along the perimeter of the interlocking concrete pavers where there's a change of paver material. So sometimes you can go from, let's say, stepping stone to a paver patio. It's good to have those edging in all those places where the pavement can move, can shift. So that's the main purpose, is to keep the interlock intact. Edging. So if it's placed directly on the base, it would look something like this, directly on the crushed stone base, if it's a dense aggregate base. And you can see in this picture, you see how you got that 8 inches of width. You also have the geotextile that goes along the side as well, right? And like I said, the minimum is 6 inches of base material extended wider than the beyond the edge of the pavers. But what's recommended is 8 inches. So anywhere from 6 to 8 inches minimum as your minimum extra width on the side for the base material. Different types, like we mentioned, can be done by hand or with this rammer tool where you can put an attachment on it. You can cut it by hand using something like this, or simply use your saw with a diamond blade. It cuts easily along curves. And then there's other types of edging, right? There's the plastic edge that we're familiar with. There's aluminum. There's concrete, precast or cut stone edging. There's restraints formed on site, commercial site. Sometimes they pour concrete, curbing. So there's different types, using the proper one and knowing what's good for what application. So if you're using anything that's vehicular application, you just want to make sure that you have something that can, that's appropriate for the types of loads or pressures that are going to be applied to your pavement. Any questions related to that? Yeah, great question. So what's the name of that tool, John, for putting in the spikes? It's called the... Okay, so there's one out back. We'll take a look at it this afternoon. And then do we have the rammer as well for it, or just the attachment? Yeah, it's like an impact drill. An impact drill with the bit. He's got the bit there. We'll talk about it this afternoon. Yeah. And on each tool out back, there's forgot to mention that. I mentioned that earlier this week, but there's a QR code. So if you scan the QR code, it'll bring you up to a video. So it'll show you how to use the tool. It'll tell you the name of the tool and also the price of the tool. So if ever you're interested in any of those tools, just scan the QR code. It'll bring you to the page with the video. Most of the tools out back have a video attached to it. All right, so some of the tools that you would use to put in your nail could be a 3 to 5 pound mallet, 10-inch nail, non-galvanized. The reason why you don't want the nail to be galvanized is if the nail rusts into the ground, it's actually better for, it creates a better hold it rusts in place, and it's actually much harder to remove a nail that's rusted into the ground than to remove one that's galvanized. If ever you've tried both, it's really hard to, so it's recommended to use a nail that's non-galvanized. And again, to cut, you can use cutters or just a saw. Now for your bedding sand. So the reason why in most installation it's recommended by SCPI to use bedding sand is because of the drainage properties. You don't want anything to be underneath your pavers that doesn't drain properly, right? Sand is great. HPB, easy to work with. But you have less interlock with HPB, right? The finer, the finer, like sand, but still drains well, creates better interlock underneath your pavers. So for vehicular applications, for instance, when you're using sand, you're gonna get better interlock with sand. A lot of people use HPB for everything. Fine, it may work, but in cases where, let's say you have heavy loads, it may not work. I'll give you an example. So there was a driveway installation that went in a few thousand square feet. And the contractor never asked the client what kind of vehicles would be going on top of this pavement, right? So they used open graded, they used something like HPB, wasn't HPB, but it's the same thing. And they used slabs, right? Like the bigger, like the regular, it's like 12 by 18, 12 by 12, and 12 by 6, the most common one that we see. And so they use that for the driveway. They use a 60 millimeter, which is not meant really for driveway because, I mean, it may withstand the loads, but it may not. So he forgot to ask the client what he had for vehicles. The following spring, the contractor gets a call and the owner says, hey, we have a lot of stone that broke this spring. The contractor couldn't figure out why that would be. It had never happened to him. So he shows up at the property and in fact, he sees that there's like this track of broken slabs that leads right to the backyard, right from the front to, and all the big ones in the tire tracks were broken. So especially around the house, because there was a little curve going around the house in the back. So the contractor goes and to speak to the client and starts asking questions. Says, well, did you do anything different? What kind of vehicles? At that point, he asked what kind of vehicles were running on top of it. And so the client said, well, I just brought my motor coach home. And he said, well, what kind of motor coach do you have? He said, well, it's a 50,000 pound motor coach, right? Well, when you're running a 50,000 pound motor coach on top of the wrong type of slab, there's a good chance that if you don't have the proper base and the proper stone and not enough interlock, so where it wasn't interlocking, it was moving. So when he was turning that bus around the house, it was creating all this pressure on the slabs. Plus there was a lot of cracked material on that end. So not enough interlock, not thick enough, and not enough base, right? And that was just with running the bus a few times on top of it. All right. So you have to think like it may be okay in 95% of the cases, but in like 1 to 5% of cases, you have to make sure that you're asking the right questions. What kind of loads are one of them? Where is water redirected? So for instance, if he would have run that bus when it was dry, let's say in June or July, he may not have had any issues at all. But because he brought that big vehicle in a time where there's there's thawing going on, well, because it thaws that time of year, it's still soft. There's a lot of moisture in the ground. So there's a lot more possible movement if you don't have enough base material. They only had about 12 to 14 inches for base material. Well, it was still with a heavy load like that, it was reaching the subgrade for sure, right? And it was pushing the material through the subgrade in those areas where it was still soft. And plus, all the gutter system for the house, all the water from the roof was all draining out back, but it was all going underneath, like on the lawn, but right next to the driveway. So that area was super soft. So as soon as he backed up that big vehicle, that big RV in the back, a lot more bricks or a lot more stones were broken because it was still soft. So there was a lot of movement in that area. Again, might not be an issue if everything was super dry and it was summer, but it was the wrong time of the season with the wrong type of stone, with the not enough base material and not enough interlock. Absolutely. So great question. The question was, is it the contractor's responsibility to tell the client that 60 millimeter is not the right? It absolutely is. It's the contractor's responsibility to go with the specifications of the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer says it's recommended 80 inches or 80 millimeter or 100 millimeter paver or slab for a certain type of application, absolutely. And so if something breaks, you're 100% liable for something, especially if it's not specified that way. So I'll give you an example. In Ottawa, I got a phone call from a contractor who said, yeah, can you come see a job? The client's complaining. He says he's got some broken pieces. Now he wants to sue me because he wants me to replace all the stone, because he checked with the manufacturer and the manufacturer says that 60 millimeter, it's not meant for vehicular applications. And I said, they're absolutely right. You have to go with the manufacturer specs, right? The recommendations. So who's to blame, right? You may not have any issues at all and the client may never give you a hard time. And maybe a couple stones will break and you'll have to replace a couple stones and that's it. But if the client complains and decides to move forward with a lawsuit or just have you replace a lot more than just a couple pieces, you may be held liable for it. I'll give you another example. There was it wasn't our job, but we got the call because the client was trying to get a hold of his old contractor, the previous contractor, and the contractor wouldn't show up. So we got a call for a repair. And when I showed up, it was visible that all the bigger slabs in the front of the driveway were all broken. And so we were trying to figure out, is it a base issue? So we just tried to do like a test hole on the outside to see like how much base we had and all that stuff. And it seemed like it was more like material related, but we couldn't figure out why the other bricks, the other pavers slabs were not broken. So we were talking, we went out back, we looked at the patios out back, everything was fine, in front of the garage, all fine. And then all of a sudden, this FedEx truck comes in the driveway and basically just the noise of the front tires hitting the front of the driveway because the driveway was sloped up. So when the truck came in, you could hear the front end basically go up the driveway. And we turned around and I'm like, well, how often does that truck come into your driveway? He says, pretty much every day, sometimes 2 times a day, 2 or 3 times a day. And I was thinking, okay, that's a different load than just your small car or minivan. That's a few tons hitting your driveway every day in the same spot. And there's all that load hitting what seemed to me to be a high speed, but just a high speed for the small area, right? So again, adding a couple more questions into your sales process and asking those questions. What kind of vehicles are you going to have in the yard? What kind of vehicles do you have? And if it's a curved driveway, if sometimes you're doing a driveway where the cars can actually go around and exit. Well, if the wheels or the tires are going to turn on pavers, that's a totally different ball game than if you're coming in and out straight. When you have tires turning on pavements, that pushes the pavers sideways, right? There's a lot of horizontal lateral pressure. So you're not dealing with the same type of application. So the more interlock is needed for those type of applications. So bedding sand, again, coming back to drainage. So HPB, again, really good for drainage. So you won't have much issues there. It's easy to screed, and it stays dry all the time. So people love it because it's easy to work with. The only disadvantage, you have less interlock. If you want better interlock, let's say for a driveway, we're going to have vehicle applications, wheels turning, then sand could be a better option because then you get interlock right from the bottom. It's smaller, it gets through the joints on the bottom, and it creates better interlock. It still has good drainage properties, but you have to keep it somewhat dry on site. So you probably need to tarp it to make sure that if you get any heavy rain, you don't have any issues the next morning when you're trying to screed that material. So pros and cons. Now let's talk about drainage properties of like limestone, which becomes an issue with pavers, and then also stone dust. The reason why stone dust is used a lot is because it's cheap, right? And it's available pretty much everywhere. So that's one positive, I guess. The other positive is you can still use it, still screed it. If it rains a little bit on it, it's no big deal. But one of the big issues is that the fines in the stone dust is high. And when you look at how clay soils are defined, well, clay soils are defined as clay soils because if you have 30% of fines or more, it's defined as a poor draining type soil. So let's say if I would be asking you if you could screen clay, would you use that as your material underneath your pavers? If you could screen clay, would you do it? Most people say no. So, right? Clay would be no good, right? But some stone dust is equal in terms of performance as a clay. Not as bad, because there's clays that are worse than others, but because there's 30% plus in fines, what can happen is this. If moisture gets trapped into your stone dust, it gets really weak. All right? And if you have, let's say, a driveway where cars are going in and out every day in the same spot, when it's dry, it's not an issue. But when it gets wet, the particles have more chances of moving. Because the smaller it is, the weaker it gets, the easier they move under moisture. It's just like clay. Put water into clay and it becomes super weak, right? Sticky, weak. The same happens with stone dust. So you'll have that rutting created a lot easier with something like a stone dust because it performs like a clay. Not necessarily as bad, but it does perform like clay. It becomes weak. So that's why that would not be recommended at all for vehicle applications. Doesn't mean it's going to fail, but it could. All right. So it all has to do with water. If you have no moisture into it, you're fine. But if you have moisture into it, then you have issues. Again, comes back to water. But sand and HPB will prevent that because of their properties of draining easily. Does that make sense? So if you've used stone dust, don't worry. When I remember when I was listening to someone saying that, I was like, oh man, how many jobs did I screw up, right? It's not necessarily that you screw them up. It's just that in the worst of conditions, it will perform poorly. But if you're doing a patio, a walkway, I wouldn't be even worried about it, right? It's not a big deal because you don't have any heavy loads on top of them. So it's not like much can happen. If you have a weak base, you can have the best sand and the best HPB under your pavers, but you have a weak base, it's still going to move, right? So maybe nothing to do with it. So all the components are really important when you're building your interlocking concrete pavement system. So if you're using bedding sand, there's still some moisture needed. If it's too dry or too wet, the installation process will be affected. Okay, so some moisture is needed for being able to compact the pavers into the sand, and so you have to just keep that in mind. If you're gonna use sand, something like a masonry sand is not the same thing as a concrete sand. Concrete sand is like it drains a lot better because there's no fines in it. It's been washed, basically. But the masonry sand has too many fines in it, so it wouldn't perform the same as a concrete sand. Now, before installing your bedding sand, we're going to talk about it this afternoon, but the best way to test that last layer to make sure that it's even on the whole area enough to be ready for the sand is you have to do a few tests. So if you have a 10-foot screeding bar, for instance, there's a couple out back we'll show you. If you have a screeding bar and you put it on top of the base, if you can fit a pencil underneath, you need to add a bit more material. Because what's going to happen if you fill those indentations with sand, let's say you even everything out, let's say your base material is like this, and you just fill it up with sand all over. Eventually your surface on top of the pavers is going to look like that because it's going to settle into place. If it settles into 2 inches of sand over here and 1 inch there, it means that it's just going to settle about a 1/4 inch here, but 1/2 inch over here eventually. So that's going to be a lot lower than this spot. So in order to prevent this, there's minimum standards to follow. So if you can fit a pencil, it's too much. If you can't fit the pencil, you're good to go. That's basically what's recommended. And we'll do a demonstration this afternoon of this. When you're ready to screed, well, if you're using a screeding tool like this one, it's handy. You don't have to get on your knees. But essentially, you would have 2 pipes laid directly on the base. Given that the base is ready to go, it's got the proper elevations, and you would fill the middle with sand or whatever else you're using and screed back. The most important part is just to make sure that it's even throughout. And when you remove those pipes, that you fill that area with more sand. A little bit like this one. So you see there's numerous ways you can use this tool. You can use a piece of wood. The only thing with wood is you got to make sure that it's in perfect condition. It's not warped or curved because it could really affect the top grade. And then the goal is to put all that sand so that you can lay your pavers on top of it. All right. Once your pavers are on top of it, one of the common mistakes is that people put the sands in the joints right away and then they compact it. But there's a step before even putting the sand in the joint, and it's compacting the pavers into the bedding sand, because that starts the interlock process. The sand goes into the joint from the bottom, and it evens out the pavers also. Because if sometimes it happens, you have some pavers, slabs, stone, depending if you're using sometimes even stone, natural stone, they're not going to be even perfect everywhere sometimes. So compacting it into your bedding sand will even out the surface. And then you'll be ready for putting the sand into the joints. All right. So 2 reasons: it evens out the surface, and it helps with creating more interlock from the bottom right to start. Then you compact your sand into the joints. The most commonly used here is polymeric sand, But there's a lot of commercial application where they can just use regular concrete sand. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it's just like you might have to replace it more often. So a rule of thumb for sand is if it's less than a half inch from the chamfer. So the chamfer is that little piece right at the corner right here. If it's lower than a half inch below the chamfer, you would have to add more, or else it could start to fail. Your system, the interlocking could start failing. The pavers could start rubbing together and create issues. So half inch is the rule of thumb for having to put more sand into the joints. But essentially every manufacturer of sand will tell you right on their material, on the bag, what to do. Sometimes you have to fill the joints, compact once, fill again, compact twice, right? And sometimes some products require water, some require less water. Just make sure that whatever sand you use, look at the directions by the manufacturer. There's so many different types of sand now that it's really worth getting familiar with that. Any questions related to the sand? Yep. So the first part of it, the interlock process, is sand goes in from the bottom, and then it usually fills the first quarter inch on the bottom is usually your bedding sand. And then when you put your poly sand, when you compact it in, you want to make sure that you're compacting so there's a roller compactor out back that we'll take a look at. And what that really helps with is filling the joint properly. So the tighter the joints, the harder it's going to be to put your sand in there. So sometimes the more times you'll have to add sand to really get it in there. But the goal is to get the poly sand as close to the bottom of whatever wasn't filled with the process of compacting your pavers into the bedding sand. But yeah, you want the poly sand to go basically and touch the sand from the bottom. Yeah. If it's properly done, you'll have about a quarter inch that's from the bottom, and the rest will come from the poly sand. Yeah. High performance sand, that's the same type of sand that you would use for like around pools. The absorption level is a lot less. So usually the infiltration rate is just 1% or less. And usually it's got those properties where it'll fit in tight spaces. So do I have a specific manufacturer? No. From my experience, it's been high performance sand, but you guys have any sand that you use for very tight spaces? We have sand from, what's the name of the bags out back? There's both high performance. So you have some for the wide joints, you have some for the tighter joints, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. But it's a great question. We'll see what's out back. But if anyone else is using anything for any type of sand specific to tight joints, feel free to give your input. But usually it's the high performance sands that are better for that in any brand, but we'll see what's out back as well. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, concrete sand is what you would, concrete sand is more expensive. So that's usually one of the reasons why, let's say a load of stone dust is dirt cheap compared to, it's like a quarter of the price. Yeah. For us in Ottawa, it's 4 times the price almost. So that's why a lot of people try to use what's cost effective, and they weigh the pros and the cons, right? So they're like, well, I'm doing this type of installation. If it's an installation where you want nothing to go wrong, let's say you have that driveway I was talking about where you're going to have a 50,000 pound vehicle running on top of it, you want to make sure that every step is like to your advantage. So saving on a material is not necessarily the time to try to save, especially depending on the application. But if you're doing a patio or a walkway, do you need to go with something that's 4 times the price if something's already working for you? Probably not, but it's just stuff to consider. They all have pros and cons. Now, the same thing with your selection with pavers and slabs. Pavers and slabs are not the same. So pavers are great for bigger loads like vehicular applications because the load, when it's spread on top of your pavers, it goes to the base much quicker because it's much smaller. But if you're running a car on top of a slab, all the load goes through that slab and it spreads on that slab. So that's why it's more prone to breakage, because the slab takes most of the load before it goes to the base, right? So the bigger the slab, the more widespread is the load on top of it. And so you have to consider that when you're considering materials, all right? So they don't perform the same way, but they're great in terms of, for efficiency. From most of the companies that I know that are doing residential right now, they're using slabs. Most people here use slabs. Raise your right hand if you use slabs a lot more than pavers. People want them, right? Yeah, so great for efficiency, great for the looks, great for the trends that are going on right now for sure. And, but not that great for vehicular application. The bigger the slab, the less performance you get out of it unless the thickness is there to support it. Okay, so just to keep in mind. And when you use slabs, they flex a lot more under load, and if they flex too much, they break. So it's to keep in mind. Yep. Okay. Yep. Well, if you use the 80 millimeter, I would have to check the specification, the manufacturer, but that option there is what would be recommended for heavier loads. It all depends on how it's spec'd by the manufacturer. So if it says it can take a certain amount of load, you'd be good. Yeah, but definitely, yeah. So pedestrian areas, residential driveways, 2 3/8, which is 60 millimeter thick pavers are used usually. The same for slabs. It's appropriate. When it's a driveway, that's where you want to go into the 80 millimeter, like the gentleman right over here had used. Like this one for vehicular, street, industrial, airports, pavements, 80 millimeter or more. That gets pretty heavy, and that's when you would really want to consider tools, because as much as you want to be doing the right thing and using the proper thickness, consider this into your price. It can add considerable amount of hours if it's all done by hand. If it weighs more, it's more on the labor, right? So things to consider also. Some of the things to know are also patterns. For instance, if you have vehicular applications, it's to your advantage to do a herringbone pattern. Like this one, you can be creative. Even if you're using slabs, like 80 millimeter slabs, you can still do a herringbone pattern and get both the advantage of getting better interlock and the look also. So herringbone is either it's 45 or 90 degree herringbone will be more efficient. A few things to consider for your pavers. So here, this is what's called a chamfer later on, and it's got a couple purposes. One of the purpose is chipping. It prevents from your pavers to be chipped. The second is for water flow. All right. So your water will drain faster. So one common mistake that I see is people filling up the sand up to the top of the chamfer, right? And what that does is some of the water is going to wash out some of that sand and it will not drain properly over your surface eventually. Maybe not at first. If it's all filled up everywhere, at first it'll drain fine. But eventually, this is some of the sand is going to wash out and then it'll always, the water will always flow in the same direction or over the same surface and may affect how much water or how much sand are in your joint, because it might wash out that sand if it's always flowing in the same direction, and eventually it'll make those pavers fail. So by keeping your sand just underneath your chamfer here, it will help have even water flow on your surface. So it also helps for the water and drainage on top of your pavers. There's also a spacer bar. This is what keeps an even separator between your pavers to put your sand. Sometimes this spacer bar is wider. For instance, if you're using a paver that's good for permeable pavers, usually that's going to be wider because your material that goes into the joint is usually about 1/8 of an inch, a little bit bigger sometimes. So you need a wider joint. The only thing to remember with that, I remember pricing out a job. It was a large patio in the backyard, several thousand square feet. And I told the client, as long as the price is the same for the material that you pick, I'll be fine to install it for the same price, which is not really right, because if you would have chosen a slab, you can install a slab a lot faster than a paver. With my luck, he chose a paver that was a permeable paver with a wide joint. And I never even considered the difference in price with just the sand, the amount of poly sand, extra sand. If I would have used a slab, I could do about 100 square feet on one bag. But with that type of paver, I could only do 20 square feet. So I was using 5 times the amount of sand with that paver. So instead of, let's say, using about 20 bags, I needed about 100 bags of sand. So at $25 a bag or $20 a bag or whatever that is, it was 80 times 20, $1,600 plus tax. So I'm almost at $2,000 extra just in poly sand for that job. So consider the amount of sand that goes into the joint for your jobs. And that all has to do with the height and the width in between in your joints. Any questions related to pavers and slabs choice for your jobs? All right. A few considerations when you're doing paver installations is how you install it. Do we do it manually, mechanically, with vacuum, suction equipment, or clamps, or whichever way you're going to do it, it can make a huge difference. Like I said, you can go from installing 100 square feet per hour if it's small pavers, to maybe 200 if it's slabs, to 700 plus if you're using other types of equipment that allow you to do so. There's one common method that's known in the industry as click and drop. The reason why it's click and drop is what's recommended is you got to be careful so that you don't scrape the paver on top of your sand. So what's recommended is to bring it tight to the top of your paver and then drop it. And the same if you're using suction equipment or you're doing if you're using any other types of equipment, is just to make sure that you're doing it straight from the top and that you're not scraping the material in between the joints, because you won't have the equal amount of joints throughout and it'll be uneven. So for you experienced installers, it's not an issue, but for those new installers coming in, we see that often where they put it on the sand and then they pull it towards the paver, and then you have some issues with your install. So click and drop, basically just click it in place on top and then drop it straight down. You have different types of patterns here. You have the runner pattern, parquet, herringbone. This is with pavers, but you can do that with slabs also, right? The same applies. Sailor course. I always remember that sailor course is like sailors on water, and water is horizontal, and then soldier stands up straight. So that's how I think about those two, the difference between the two, soldier course and sailor course. A great way to start installing is first find your a place that's perpendicular, where you can start at a point where it's going to be straight on both sides. You want to make sure that I think I have more coming up, but when you're laying up the patterns, you have to keep in mind that every manufacturer tries to produce the material the exact same way, but stuff like temperature, moisture can affect the product, the color of the product. So if you're ordering materials more than one pallet, a great practice is to mix the material while you're installing. So install 2 or 3 pallets of this and take some from each pallet while you're installing. Because if you don't, what could happen is you end up with one color, and then as you're moving along the driveway or a large surface, you can see exactly the difference between each product. So if you're an experienced installer, you've probably come across this already, or even if you have to deal with something like efflorescence. Efflorescence is like that white, visible, salt almost looking type of effect that comes out of the paver when it's curing, right? It's natural, it happens. It's not pleasant to, let's say, for the contractor to try to explain to a client that it's normal that happens. You have some efflorescence cleaner that you can apply to get rid, or with time sometimes, if it's not too bad, it'll just wash out with time and clear out. But you have to know it's part of the process. But if you have more efflorescence in one pallet, let's say in one material pallet than another, that's why mixing it in could be to your advantage instead of having all of it in one spot. So for different reasons, you want to make sure that you're installing it from different pallets if you have several. Again, using string lines can help you to keep straight lines, and you want to make sure that you're checking your lines every 6 feet and horizontally, and then you can also have some vertical lines going this way. Essentially, building in a pyramid is the most effective and effective way to install and to keep straight lines and to build out. So just to keep in mind. Again, checking your lines, adjusting your lines, making sure that you're not, if you're using different types of materials, sometimes make sure that you break your patterns so that you don't create this. Sometimes you'll use just a mixed pattern, but what can happen if you don't break up those lines? You can have a weak point created into your in your install just by not having lines that are too long and not breaking them apart. So that's where you lose some of your interlock if you don't break that line. So keep that in mind while you're installing. You want to keep your lines straight, but you also want to break them to keep that interlock intact. Establishing a perpendicular line, there's a couple ways to do this. So there's the 3-4-5 method. The reason why it's called 3-4-5 is if you have, for instance, 3 meters, which is 6 feet, by 4 meters on this end. When it's perpendicular, you should have 5 meter or 10 feet on this. So you would move these two lines to connect. So you have 4, 3, and 5. And that's how you know it's perpendicular. If it's not, then you have to keep moving them until they are. But essentially that gives you, so that ratio, the 3-4-5 ratio, no matter which measurement you have, applies to finding the perpendicular. That's one way of finding, establishing perpendicular lines. Or you can do something like this where you find the midpoint between two lines, and then you bring two measuring tapes, and as long as you have the same length here and there, this should be perpendicular, so you would know where to start in the middle here. So if you're starting against the house, that would be one example. Around the pool. Marking your pavers, there's several ways to do it. The important thing about cutting your pavers is to know that bring the saw to the pavers and not the pavers to the saw. So that's what's going to make you efficient. So whether you're cutting in place or you have a table saw type, then you can just make sure that it's close to where you need to cut, and then that the saw is there, so you don't have to walk back and forth to the saw to be efficient. Something like having a paver puller. I don't know if we have one today. I don't know if John is still here, but if not. But paver extractors are extremely useful. If you are doing an install and you have a cracked paver like this one, you can easily remove it. A paver extractor is just like a clamp. It goes into the joints, and then you can remove it easily. It's better to do it before you install the sand. But even if you had the sand in there and there's a crack, you just have to put a little bit of water if you use poly sand to soften up that sand to be able to bring your tool in between the joints and then pull it back. Suction equipment works well also when you don't have when you're not dealing with the sand, if there's no sand yet in the joint. So either techniques can work depending on what you have available. Compacting your pavers or compacting your base, pretty much the same method is recommended. Again, like I mentioned before, the perimeter first, and then going up and down, side to side. If you're using the old method, you could always just use a regular compactor with either a rubber or poly, I forget the long term, but basically these plates that you just install right underneath. Or now you have the roller compactor. We have an example out back that helps from scuffing the pavers. So I've used a 1/4-inch plywood before. I've even seen people use geotextile just to protect, like that non-woven geotextile is really good for that. But I find with geotextile, you can still break the little corners, and it might not scuff the top, but it could still break the corners if you're using something that's sharp for like stone, for instance. And the minimum should be a compactor with a centrifugal force of 5,000 pounds. So like these smaller compactors usually are appropriate for that. Too big could also be risky. Any questions? Now for the joint sand material, again, you just want to make sure that you're doing it as per the manufacturer's recommendations. The goal is to get the joints filled up with it. So you fill it up once, you compact the top. It's going to drop a little bit more because it takes the air out in between the joints and the material. It's going to drop, you refill it again, you repeat the process until it's up to just underneath the chamfer like I had mentioned. So you want to make sure that you do it until it's up to that level. And the wider the joint, the easier it's going to be to fill, and the less you'll have to repeat the process. But the tighter the joint, the more you'll have to repeat the process, and the harder it is. Also to keep in mind. Again, you can use concrete sand for the joints, which is, you don't see that a lot up here, but I see it a lot in the US. People save a lot of money by just using regular concrete sand. But stabilized sand like poly sand is what's used most commonly here because it helps for preventing losing the sand with the heavy water. It's great for preventing to lose sand when there's windy conditions. So all these things will help to keep the joints intact. Again, with different types of installation, if you're using a poly sand that requires water to to make the polymer, to activate the polymers, then you'll need to do this. And sometimes too much water or not enough water will affect the installation. The goal is to get the same result through and through from top to bottom. I know that when you're installing it, it's hard because all you see is the top. But if you're using it according to manufacturer specification, it should be from top of paver to the bottom where the joint is filled. You should get the same through and through moisture or whatever else is needed for proper installation. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes too much water or not enough will definitely affect the installation. And then finishing the project, well, that's where I was saying this morning, if a lot of crews get quite excited at this stage and are getting ready to leave, a lot of details can be forgotten. So things to check are there any broken pieces? Is cleanup well done? Is there any poly sand left on the surface? For instance, I had a crew once, I got a call from they worked actually pretty late. So they were trying, but they worked pretty late and it got dark and they didn't notice that there was a lot of poly sand, well, not a lot, but enough that it was significant enough in front of the steps where there wasn't any lighting because of the shadows, they couldn't see. But they left some poly sand not swept off and not, well, usually you use a blower on the surface to make sure it's all nice and clean. They just forgot to clean right next to the steps and it rained. Then the client called me that weekend to say, hey, we got some poly sand glued on top of the pavers and it's like rock hard and it's full of it in front of the steps. So not only did we have to remove those pavers because it was really like rock hard, basically almost baked on it at this point, but it was really just not workable. Had to remove those pavers and then we had to remove it behind the steps. It just got really complicated on top of the cap stones on top of the steps. So anyways, it would have been so much simpler to just run the blower on top of it, make sure, because that cost us about 3 hours of just like useless, painful, and having to bring in more materials to just do a repair that was quality, just for something that we could have done in 2 minutes, right? So proper cleanup, making sure that nothing's left over, but also forgetting tools is one of the big things. Like, turning around to go pick up a shovel and a measuring tape, now not really worth it, but could be 50, 60, $80, right? Just for a couple items. So I guess pros and cons of leaving the job quickly. The best thing you can do is having a checklist, putting something in place where when the foreman gives you all the paperwork for the job, also provides a checklist with pictures. So now most of the companies that I work with as a consultant, they have files on the cloud. So they use something like Google Suite for their Google Drive, where they have a file for each client. So they have all the pictures in there. They have the checklist for when their job is completed. So the proof that basically the foreman went through all the steps to close off the job right. He's got the pictures, proper cleanup, proof of the proper cleanup. One thing that saved me a couple times was clients or customers that would leave on vacation. So we do a brand new install, the hardscape looks great, we do a lawn installation, we finish it all off, we plant the trees, the plants, everything's good. We leave, the clients calls us 2 weeks later and they say, hey, we just got home from vacation, everything's dead, right? All the plants, all the lawn, everything's yellow. Of course, because they didn't water it. But, we did our job, but they said the lawn wasn't that great to start with, right? Trying to get us to replace it. We had pictures and we had a contract that said, we're not responsible for watering it. And we provided proof with the nice pictures when the grass was really nice and green. The plants were all alive. So, didn't pursue anything against us for that, but having pictures saved us. And especially on that job where I can remember where it would have been painful. It was over 12,000 square feet of lawn. It would have been very miserable to have to go back because I didn't have any proof. But a simple picture of a nice green lawn was really ideal in that scenario. So pictures, not just for putting it on social media, but for your own files is very useful. Getting the client to approve it is even better. So doing a walk around with your checklist and saying, hey, we've got all this. Do you have anything else? As soon as they sign it off, you're good. You should be able to get paid at that point. So I know that's not always easy because you're like rushing to the next job, but it's the most efficient way for sure. And can save you just a pain of having to chase the client later. Any questions for that? Specialty applications. So I just want to talk about a few things around pools, around the houses. So when you're looking at projects like these ones, there's just a couple things that you have to make sure that you keep in consideration. Where I see the most failure in these types of application is capstone not being properly glued. Okay, when you're gluing a capstone on top of concrete, try to glue the stone in this direction. So if you put your lines of glue or your beads, just making sure that the water can flow through. Some people put the glue like this and it prevents the water from flowing. So the water stays underneath the capstone, and then when it freezes, it pops the capstone. That's why you get calls in the spring and clients say, hey, I got a few loose capstones. It's because the water doesn't flow through. Often that's why. So just making sure that your glue is in a direction or placed in a way where water can still flow through and dry out, instead of blocking it by putting one strip like this and then the water can't flow out. That's one example. Does anyone install pool? Well, I guess we had one pool installer here, but does anyone here do projects like these where you're doing a lot of work around pools, right? So you too. So there's another thing you have to keep in mind when you do pavers like this around a pool is you should have a minimum of 30 to 36 inches of concrete around to put your pavers on top. And that prevents from settlement. When you don't have that concrete collar around the pool, oftentimes what happens is you'll see a lot of settlement right in behind the steel panels or the fiberglass shell. So by having that 36 inches of concrete collar and that overlay of pavers on top, it'll prevent from any settlement to take place. So the big thing is you got to watch out for the plumbing. And so when you have a lot of plumbing, you just got to make sure that you're using the proper material. That's where 3/4 inch clear requires less compaction. It's easier to put, but you still have to manage the water in behind the pool. So concrete collar is the best way to go around a pool for sure. Just trying to think of anything else. Any other issues that you've had around pools? You got to make sure that your grading is away from the pool. So you want the water to drain the opposite direction. You don't want the water to drain into the pool, because the pool could fill up if you had a big rainfall, or if all the water on your surface of your pavement, your patio, would drain into your pool. So you want it to drain away. So a minimum of 1 to 2% grade away from your pool. And yeah, any other issues that you've had around pools? Yeah. So when you have a cap around the pool, say the last part again. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. You got to make sure that the materials work for the type of application. So the thickness, or even, no. Yeah. You could adjust the elevation with the collar. Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point. So working with the same pool company, you might not have the issue, but sometimes the client has the best intention and says, hey, I'm going to work with this pool contractor, and then you come in after. But I've seen myself go on jobs where the finish work on the concrete is horrible, right? And so I have to make many adjustments, grinding, to make sure that I'm trying to just put my material on top of it. I have it priced one way. So having your contract, if you're going to do pool work like this, is just to say that the condition of your concrete collar has to be a certain way or a certain height for you to work with it. If you're not going to be the one doing it or supervising it, I would definitely have a clause in there to say like any extra work to be done to that concrete work before you install the pavers on it will be on the owner's cost and not yours. Because there's a huge difference between coming in and installing a coping, a capping around it in just a few hours, or coming in, then you need a few hours just to do the prep work before even installing it. So absolutely essential to keep in mind. Paver patios, pillars and walls, again, I would say that the most important part is just making sure that you have the right base prep. I've learned that for, let's say, my pillars, my outdoor kitchens, I didn't, and my steps. My steps, if I was building steps in front of an entry, if I was building pillars, or if I was building like an outdoor kitchen, I would just do it on concrete. Because the weight of it, if there's any movement, you know, there's nothing worse than looking at a wall or a pillar that has shifted a little bit because it's settled, and then it'll just look worse and worse every year. The same for like an outdoor kitchen. It's heavy. It's not what you want to start seeing if you have a countertop that's expensive on the top, like granite or stone, and it starts shifting. It's not just the shifting; it's the whole thing that could be affected by it. So, and steps. If you're using smaller units for steps, you know how it is. It's as soon as it starts shifting, it starts looking really bad and it's hard. So I prefer using larger steps type stone, but it's even easier if you're just going to build it right on top of a concrete slab, and then you fill the middle with a clear stone so you have zero movement ever. It's easy to compact, easy to build, it's fast, and with just the amount of time you're going to save building it, it could even pay for the difference of the cost of for the concrete. For the retaining walls, for the concrete. So for retaining walls, we're going to talk about it tomorrow, but what I've done before for retaining walls is use flowable fill. So flowable fill is a flexible concrete, and it's self-leveling. So literally, we've had engineers spec it before where we could excavate a trench, which is usually between 2 to 3 feet for your retaining wall trench. We'll talk about all these details tomorrow, but we would excavate the trench and we would get the cement truck to come in with flowable fill, which is a flexible concrete. It would self-level. So the next day we come in and it's all level, all ready to go. And if you've ever worked with flowable fill, it's easy to scrape the surface. Like it never really cures. It's weird. It's as hard as a base material that's been compacted to the max, but it never cures and it's still flexible. So we've got that spec before for our retaining walls. That's a great question. We're going to be talking about retaining walls tomorrow. Again, outdoor kitchens, making sure that you get the proper ventilation. That's the most important part. Fire features, again, proper ventilation. Usually you need 2 vents for the air coming in and bringing it out. So making sure that you include these into your pricing. Lighting. We're going to talk about lighting this afternoon. I want to talk about easy installs, how easy it is. So when we talk about the pavers this afternoon, I would like to talk about some of the new features, lighting that goes right into your pavers. You can core drill your pavers to add more to your patios and driveways now. So all these come into play. Fire features, again, more about ventilation and making sure that you hire a professional plumber if you're running natural gas or anything to it. There's codes that you have to follow, regulations that you have to follow. So just make sure that you hire the proper professionals to help you. Again, steps overlays. I mean, they're really nice when they look sharp. but it all has to do with proper compaction for sure. And there's nothing worse than seeing a step that's starting to fail. So in this case, this is where it pays off to have the proper base prep.